So I wanted to introduce all of you to Joia Erin Thornton. I'm so excited that she agreed to participate with us today. Joia, I met her a few years ago and she is powerhouse. And I'm just really excited that she agreed to talk about this subject today. So without further ado, again, thank you all for being patient. Joia Erin Thornton is the National Policy Strategist at the Southern Center for Human Rights, an NNJ member. Joia is an avid civil rights advocate, writer, historian, and policy leader. She has a unique hometown experience growing up in both Memphis and New Orleans, two cities on the mighty Mississippi River riddled with class, race, and educational disparities. These experiences have heavily impacted her passion and work toward the continued progression of civil and human rights. An ample amount of her work is dedicated to grassroots organizing, program implementation, and model design in state and national policy reform. She is presented at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund Capital Punishment Conference, the National Civil Rights Museum Journey to Justice Symposium, and the NBA Cares Memphis Grizzlies Social Justice Panel, to name a few. She has also launched the Faith Leaders of Color Coalition, or FLOC, a group of BIPOC faith leaders concerned about the use of the death penalty state and nationwide. Ms. Thornton has a Bachelor of Arts from Louisiana State University in English and French, and a Master of Public Administration, Policy, and Legal Studies from the University of Memphis. Most recently, Ms. Thornton has joined the 2021 Leadership Memphis Executive Cohort class. And with that, I will turn it over to Joia.
Thank you so much, Angeline. I thank you for this opportunity as well to be able to speak with all of you. I saw some of the participants' name, and I hope that this is not too much preaching to the choir, but this is a topic that I am very passionate about, and I want to go a little deeper with you on today about it. So good afternoon. As said, I am the National Policy Strategist at the Southern Center for Human Rights. I want to at first express my gratitude to Angeline Fraser-Giles and the National Network for Justice for this fall series. You know, fall is my absolute favorite time of the year, and place in the chat your favorite season so we can just kind of see what is each other's favorite season for a little icebreaker. In my current role, I strategize with policy leaders and officials on how to advocate for and pass equitable laws in their state. My primary focus is on death penalty repeal strategies. However, there is no one size fits all in policy work from state to state. And I've worked on other issues like youth justice, life without parole, intellectual disabilities, fiscal responsibilities, and they are often included in my advocacy and policy work, depending on the priorities and the need of that particular state. So some strategies may look different or they may be similar. Please also feel free to leave comments in the chat and reserve questions for the end as I dive into this material. Also, allow me to challenge your existing convictions about the death penalty, whether you are for it, against it, or indifferent. It is very intentional that I want us to leave with insight, but also more questions as we provoke the American criminal legal system to be better, more humane, and just for everyone who experiences it. I also want to say that even though I make correlations to lynching, there are no trigger warning photos. I know sometimes when I'm scrolling through social media or even on a webinar, it's always helpful for someone to give a trigger warning so I can decide if I will engage with that content or not. And with that said, as I mentioned before, it is nearly impossible to cover every notion or idea about race and the death penalty. I will be sure to offer supplements and additional reading for those who want to go deeper. But in the time that we have together, I want to explore a couple of focus areas. Number one, historical correlations of lynching and the modern death penalty. capital punishment and white victims, and finally, prosecutorial ethics and behavior with capital charges. So with that said, I want to go ahead and share my screen. And I am doing this all over here by myself. Can everyone still hear me?
Joia, you're good.
Okay, thank you so much. So this webinar offers a conceptual framework of how race has played an outsized role in the American capital punishment system. Statistics reveal how the race of the defendant, the race of the victim, the race of the jurors, and even the race of the prosecutor may contribute to whether a defendant is sentenced to life or death or even other extreme sentencing. Since the Dred Scott decision was made March 6, 1857, there has been a harrowing mistrust of courts and their interpretation and application of African Americans or Blacks and their personhood. I would argue that this legal decision, along with the racial terror and oppression fueled by implicit and explicit biases, they have contributed to the number of capital charges brought against Blacks in states in record numbers than the total Black population as a whole, as with states like Ohio and North Carolina. Another case mentioned by policy analysts is McCleskey versus Kemp. As early as 1987, when McCleskey, a Black man, was convicted of murdering a police officer in Georgia and sentenced to death. In a writ of habeas corpus, McCleskey argued that a statistical study proved that the imposition of the death penalty in Georgia depended to some extent on the race of the victim and the accused. The study found that Black defendants who kill white victims are most likely to receive death sentences in Georgia. His appeal was based solely on a study called the Baldus study, and I want us to watch a short video on that.
For decades, criminal defense attorneys and reform advocates have argued that the death penalty is arbitrary and racially discriminatory, and therefore unconstitutional. The Supreme Court took up this argument in the landmark case of McCleskey versus Kemp. A jury convicted Warren McCleskey, an African-American man in Georgia, of armed robbery and the murder of a white police officer. He was sentenced to death. McCleskey filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in a federal district court. In his petition, McCleskey argued that Georgia's death penalty system was racially biased and therefore unconstitutional. To support his claim, McCleskey cited the Baldus study. The Baldus study, named after its author, was a 1983 study that analyzed the results of over 2,000 Georgia murder cases. The study concluded that the race of the victim and the defendant in a murder case had a significant impact on the likelihood that the death penalty would be imposed. Specifically, Black defendants were more likely to be given the death penalty than white defendants, especially in cases with white victims. The federal district court rejected McCleskey's argument, and the Court of Appeals affirmed.
The data around past racial terror and executions, particularly in the South, remain very steady. This map depicts the areas where the majority of lynchings occurred, which are also the areas where the most executions occur to this day. Incidents like these are not coincidental. Capital punishment is more commonly practiced in places where lynching of Blacks occurred more frequently and in states in which slavery was legal. I also want to pull up another short video for us. And many of us have probably seen this video, but I believe it adds a lot of depth to this conversation.
In this country, we have a death penalty that targets people of color. A race of the victim is the greatest predictor of who gets executed in America. The death penalty is lynching stepchild. We moved lynchings from outside to inside in the 1940s and 50s When the political pressure on these communities that tolerated this spectacle violence got so great that they no longer felt like they could do it with impunity. And so we had these sham trials that didn't last very long, where people were quickly convicted, many of them innocent, wrongly accused. We make all kinds of mistakes with innocent people. For every 9 people we've executed, we've identified 1 innocent person on death row. And yet, we don't say stop. We don't say wrong. We don't say this is undermining our ability to be a free, just society. We say, let's execute some more. I think that connection is directly linked to what we tolerated during the era of lynching. And we use this threat of lethal violence from an electric chair to replace the threat that was created through hanging. And I don't think it's an accident that the states with the highest lynching rates are the states with the highest execution rates. Nor do I think it's an accident that you see communities in those states that feel deeply burdened by our continuing willingness to kill people in this racialized way.
Racial bias persists today and evidenced by cases with white victims being more likely to be investigated and capitally charged. Systemic exclusion of jurors of color from service in death penalty trials and disproportionate imposition of death sentences against defendants of color. This image illustrates racial bias in the modern death penalty era, including a 2015 meta-analysis of 30 studies showed that the killers of white people were more likely than the killers of Black people to face capital prosecution. Also, a study in North Carolina showed that qualified Black jurors were struck from juries at more than twice the rate of qualified white jurors. As of 2010, 20% of those on the state's death row were sentenced to death by all white juries. An appropriate conclusion would be anyone accused of murder, regardless of race, would face death if the victim was white. It is also, of my opinion, based on the theory of the missing white woman syndrome, that the person is white, young, fairly attractive, single, and cis female, the defendant will most certainly face a timely death. Before the Commonwealth of Virginia abolished the death penalty in March of this year, 57 people of the 111 people executed since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976 were Black and/or people of color. HB 2263 and SB 1165 signed into law the abolishment of capital punishment in the Commonwealth of Virginia after years of racial disparities in executions in the state dating back to the 1900s. Let's just look at this map more closely. During this particular time frame of this map, 1900 through 1969, 185 Black people were executed for murder and only 46 whites. This is for 70 years. 48 Black people were executed for rape and 0 whites during this time period. 20 Black people were executed for attempted rape and 0 whites. And 5 Black people were executed for armed robbery and 0 whites. Virginia was one of the darkest states that clearly showed that race was a major factor in whether a person who entered the criminal legal system lived or died. I want to talk a little bit about prosecutor power. State prosecutors and/or sometimes district attorneys have sole discretion whether to pursue the death penalty against a defendant. The financial resources available in a jurisdiction, the views of the constituents and local political climate, and the prosecutor's own views can affect the likelihood of a defendant facing the death penalty. These factors can result in disparities in how often and for what crimes the death penalty is sought within a state. Almost 90% of US states elect their chief prosecutor or district attorney. In other states, they are appointed, like Alaska, Connecticut, and New Jersey. District attorneys in my home state of Tennessee serve the longest terms for elected prosecutors in the nation, which can sometimes insulate them from making partisan decisions in individual cases, but also can hinder the community's ability to hold them accountable. Tennessee prosecutors are elected to serve 8-year terms. The power in courts has seemingly shifted over the past 20 years to prosecutors. A reading suggestion that I would like for you to consider is Charged by Emily Bazelon, and I want to play a clip of her explaining this shift.
The most powerful person in the courtroom is the prosecutor. It's not the judge. We're used to thinking about the justice system as a triangle where you have the prosecutor and the defense lawyer down here, and they're on an equal playing field. And then it's the judge who's up here at the top of the triangle. But in fact, since the 1980s, we've really seen the balance of power shift in the American courtroom. And so prosecutors are now up here alongside the judge, and in a lot of ways, they have power instead of the judge. So one day I was in this specialized gun court in Brooklyn, and the guy who was facing charges was this 19-year-old. Since he'd been charged with this weapon, he'd gone to a special program, he was getting his GED, and the judge wanted to let him off the hook. So she said to the prosecutor, "Can you lower these charges from a felony to a misdemeanor? Because I really don't want to send this guy to prison." And the prosecutor said, "Sorry, no." And so the judge didn't have any choice. He ended up going to jail. And that, I think, really demonstrates how it's prosecutors, not judges, who are making these key decisions in the courtroom. So in the 1980s in the United States, there was a crime wave.
This nation has been plagued by an outbreak of crime unparalleled.
The rising tide of crime in our town. It has done such damage to Americans' traditional sense of personal security.
People were worried about crime, and they wanted to increase punishments. One of the main tools that state legislatures used to do that were mandatory minimum sentences. The person who gets to decide what the charges are in a criminal case, that person is the prosecutor. Once you have charges in place, then prosecutors almost always in our court system try to negotiate a plea bargain. They're doing that to avoid a trial. Trials are really time-consuming, they're labor-intensive, and so at this point in our system, more than 95% of convictions are obtained through plea bargains. And again, the person who has the most say and power over a plea bargain, that person is the prosecutor. The judge has to basically rubber stamp the deal at the end. But the person who decides what charges to bring and then decides what deal to offer based on those charges, every time it's the prosecutor. When prosecutors bring charges, if they charge the maximum they can, if they throw the book at you, then they have more leverage over you to persuade you to take a deal. So think about it. If you know that you did something wrong, and if you dare to go to trial, you could face 10 or 20 years in prison. But if you take the deal, then maybe you'll only go to jail for a year, maybe not at all. Think how much incentive you have to take that deal.
We need to reform the criminal justice system because people change and cities change and systems sometimes need to change.
Because prosecutors have so much power, there has been a social movement that's really arisen around the country to elect a new kind of district attorney. The idea here is to harness all of that power to try to reduce mass incarceration instead of constantly ratcheting up punishment. We've seen people like that elected as DA in cities like Philadelphia and Chicago, in Orlando, Florida, in Boston. And if you care about criminal justice reform right now, it's really important to remember that you, the voter, have the power to elect your local DA.
Okay, so I'm gonna pause it right there. And go back to this particular slide. Prosecutors possess the discretion to formulate charges that determine whether or not the death penalty is permitted if a conviction is obtained, and to propose a sentence of death. As we discussed, many prosecutors are elected officials, and they must be very attentive to their constituencies' reaction to crime, which may influence the prosecutor's decision to seek the death penalty, accept a guilty plea for a lesser sentence, agree to a plea bargain in exchange for a testimony against another defendant. We've seen a public outcry for Purvis Payne in Memphis, Tennessee, as advocates and activists are urging our district attorney, Amy Wyrick, not to seek the death penalty in his case, who is a Black man with intellectual disabilities who's been on death row for 30 years, touting his innocence. His case was also drenched in prosecutorial misconduct. Elected prosecutors are more likely to seek the death penalty given the legal requirements when there is a public outcry for capital punishment or when there is pressure from the police department. Discretion exercised by prosecutors may be a vehicle of arbitrariness and discrimination in the early cases of capital cases. And this is something that we just cannot ignore. As with what Emily Bazelon talked about, there's been this social move to elect responsible prosecutors. So what we can do, because I never like to leave a facilitated discussion without offering ideas of solution or mitigation, I want us to think about solutions to addressing race and the death penalty. Number one is to educate the public on the role of the prosecutors. Since oftentimes the prosecutors are the sole persons responsible for bringing capital charges, it is very important that you elect a prosecutor that reflects the ideals of the community. Also, elect responsible prosecutors who are fair and balanced in their views of crime and punishment. So you don't want someone too far right. Support racial justice litigation in states like North Carolina and California. The Racial Justice Act in North Carolina requires that a prisoner's death sentence be changed to life imprisonment if racial bias or discrimination was a significant factor in the decision to impose the death penalty in his or her case. And also the defendant in the Racial Justice Act litigation in North Carolina can challenge capital charges. What you can also do is dare to imagine shorter prosecutor terms in states that exceed 3 years, like in states like Tennessee and in cities like Memphis. And then also for me, I definitely believe that we should abolish the death penalty altogether. The death penalty is riddled with error, racism, classism, and also ableism. I want to also explore some questions, and we can talk about this a little later if anyone wants to elevate this in our discussion time. Is life without parole still a death sentence? Should people living with diagnosed intellectual and or mental disabilities be sentenced to death? How do you feel about the 186 people that have been exonerated from death row? Is this compelling enough for nationwide abolition? Why is junior life without parole, juvenile life without parole still admissible in the criminal legal system? The United States stands alone as the only nation that sentences people to life without parole for crimes committed before 18. I also have some further reading that I suggested for all of you who want to go deeper on a couple of different topics that we explored on here. However, with all of that said, I would love to have a conversation. I believe there's some in the chat. I haven't been checking it.
Yeah, so thank you, Joia. Thank you very much for the presentations. A few of the slides I think that you presented were very telling about this issue and how dramatic it is to see those numbers up close and personal, particularly when you looked at the map of where lynchings took place from the EJI map that they've used, and compare that to where we are today in terms of the death penalty. I think that was a very telling map. And in addition to that map, the one where you had the numbers of people who were executed for various crimes. And I think really to let people know that those crimes, in particular, when you looked at rape or robbery, that was a standalone crime in which those people were convicted of. It wasn't a rape and a murder. Rape is bad enough. There's no doubt rape is a horrible thing. But when you look at, comparatively speaking, when you looked at the number of people, Black people who were murdered, who faced the death penalty for murder, and those who faced the death penalty for rape and robbery, how disparaging those numbers are. And I really think about the fact that we in this country decided that we needed to kill people for committing those offenses. And those offenses, of course, as you know, there's no doubt that their offenses were horrible. Did they warrant rape? And could any of those folks been maybe innocent? And we really need to look at how the death penalty is administered around the country, and how do we come to terms with these things, right? So some of the questions that you asked, I think at the end were really poignant. Like, is jail WAP still a death, is considered a death sentence? And I would love to get anyone who wants to talk, or who wants to put a question in the chat or in the Q&A, please feel free to do so. If you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and I will make sure that I recognize you. But if you have any questions, you can definitely put them in the chat. I have a question for you. When you're looking at the progressive prosecutors that have been elected over time, probably in the past maybe 7 to 10 years, we've had, a few progressive prosecutors. Do you think that because there was, and their numbers are not huge by any stretch of the imagination, are those numbers huge? But do you get a sense from any of the communities in which there were progressive prosecutors? I mean, Larry Krasner stands out because he's in Philadelphia, and probably one of the first that were maybe, elected to that position, and he was a defense attorney, right? So do you see any pushback now that we've had this racial reckoning in terms of George Floyd, and pushback on policing? What has been the pushback that you see for folks talking about progressive prosecutors and how we need to prosecute to the extent of the law?
Thank you for that question. And actually, we talked a little bit about that before the webinar began. We talked about last year during the racial reckoning post George Floyd, and also post our sister Breonna Taylor, there were several operations that were put into place to militarize police departments, like Operation Relentless Pursuit and also Operation Legend. Well, this fueled a lot of people, because when you were talking about like protesters that really wanted to stand up for right, because watching the video of George Floyd was something that we possibly just could not ignore. It wasn't just young Black people. It was also young white people. It was also older white people. It was people from all different backgrounds going out there. And some of them, Seattle is one of the cities that kind of come to mind the most, that were heavily persecuted for prosecuting. There were even stories of people saying that they were thrown into vans and things like that. And there were laws passed. I know there were a couple of passed in Nashville that if you were protesting, that it would be a federal crime. So there's been a lot of pushback in regards to the way policing is done. And there's been a lot of, I would also say, kind of like an educational revival of why the prosecutor matters. It's a lot of people that abstain from voting for their prosecutors, and it's a lot of people that don't even know the role of a prosecutor. And it has kind of been my mission, especially with this new wave of people who, quote unquote, are woke and want to listen more to what's going on in our criminal legal system, of educating folks on the role of a prosecutor and what progressive prosecution looks like. So I've definitely seen it, and it's been from Seattle all the way to Miami to Atlanta, of folks really pushing back on administrations to militarize police departments, because that's not their role. Their role is to protect and to serve our community.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think when you talk about the Resist ORP that NNJ was involved in, and your group was involved in, um, what it meant for people to be out in the streets protesting and trying to push for reform in police departments and pulling back some of the funding that was going to police departments,
Right.
to put into other social,
Yes.
social situations in communities, right? To ensure that there was enough after school programs, that there were, enough mental health providers that could do ride-alongs or actually show up at the same time as the police to try to diffuse a situation. And I think that in the discussion about defunding the police, that became the rallying cry for a lot of people who said, well, we can't just defund the police, we need the police, right? And so I think just the movement of people saying, well, do you know how much your police department is receiving? How much
Right.
funding your police department is receiving versus social programs are receiving, versus after school programs, versus, any other event that needs to take place in a community, anything else that we need to fund in a community, how much is going to the police? What's the percentage of the budget that's being used? So bringing up the fact that, Seattle and some of these other cities that had all this militarized presence, people are pushing back against that. We don't want to be a militarized nation, right? We want to be able to live and pursue the happiness that we're supposed to be able to pursue, and having police presence and the surveillance that goes along with that, pulling these young kids in, it was pretty devastating for communities. And I think the education piece that you talk about is really huge, right? Educating people about what does a prosecutor do, how much power do they have. Along those lines, you want to talk about, you mentioned a little bit about people voting. And as we see these changes around the country with voting rights, right, being stifled, that has an impact on who is on the ballot and who gets to vote, right?
Absolutely.
Who's on the ballot and who wins in those particular jurisdictions where you might have maybe a progressive prosecutor on the ballot, but in actuality, if you ensure that people can't vote, people that look like you and me can't vote, then what, right? Then we don't have that reckoning to ensure that doesn't happen. And so you want to talk a little bit about voting and the importance of that.
And I was also looking at the chat too, and I want to go back to something you said about defunding the police. And I believe that it's presented in a negative way, that phrase, depending on who the messenger is. When you talk about defunding the police, it's very triggering. And some of the activists that coined that phrase is also really saying, what is the role of police departments? Should police officers be first responders in incidents that are not violent? So if you have an individual that's having a mental health crisis or a mental health breakdown, should we employ or deploy some of those funds to mental health facilities? And should we have a local number that people can call for those types of social services, or, instead of always being the police? Because I remember I forgot the young lady's name. I think she was about 16 years old. She was being bullied. She was in a foster home and she was being bullied. And if I come to think of her name, I definitely will send that link to you so I can send it out to everybody. And someone knows this case, then please put it in the chat.
This is the one
But,
that happened recently, the one that
yes,
happened
yes.
I think it was this year. I can't place her name, unfortunately, but I think I know which
Yes.
one you're talking about, but go ahead.
Yes, so she called the police. Yes, Micaiah
Thank
Bryant,
you.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine.
She called the police, and the police actually saw her as the threat instead of the young girl, the other, well, two older women that were bullying her. So when you hear phrases like defund the police, it's also saying, what is the role of police? And could those funds be deployed elsewhere in a state or in a city versus just the police department? So I definitely want to definitely cover that. I am currently residing in Atlanta, Georgia. And if you have been following what's going on in regards to voter suppression here in Atlanta, Georgia, it is very heavy and it is very oppressive. And there are activists and advocates that are constantly strategizing, organizing, to think of ways to challenge legislation and to challenge those policymakers that believe that voter suppression should be back to the Jim Crow era, where we would have to answer a test or we would have to take a test, something like that. So when I talk about voting, it's so important that people understand who you are voting for. And this is at all levels, not just the presidency. It's a lot of people that feel that, national elections, hi, from Atlanta, the national elections are the only, or presidential elections are the only elections that you should engage in, that you should participate in. And the elections that affect you the most, and many people know this on this call, are your local elections. And it's so important. I've seen a lot of other states, we're in conversations now about redistricting and the gerrymandering of different areas. It is so important that you are involved and you are present in conversations if you are in areas where you feel that you've been cracked and packed in certain places. So when I talk about voting, it's so many things that feed into why your vote matters and why you should partake in conversations regarding voter suppression.
Thank you. Yes, and being someplace where you are in Georgia, I know you feel it. You have to feel it there, that it is just repressive and oppressive, and being able to educate people on the importance of it is extremely important, because people don't know, that if you are watching, the news and the polls and all of that right now, they're talking a lot about it, the midterms, and how the midterms could really be devastating for, one particular party over the other. And
Right.
it's because part of it is that there's not the presidential, election. There's, local elections and congressmen that are up for reelection, but it's important to still go out and vote because of things like this. We saw elections matter. We see what's happening on the Supreme Court level, right?
Mhm.
And so elections matter because of the fact that you had one type of president that was able to put in more conservative members of not only the Supreme Court, but we're talking about district court level, every level of judiciary, right? That they were able to ensure that there was continuity in terms of a more conservative approach to looking at the courts. And so it is very important that people understand that every election matters. I don't care if it's the local one with just in your community, or if it's the larger one, on the national level, that every election counts, and you have to be there to let your voice be heard, definitely. So I want to again open it up. Let's see, I have one person who has raised their hand, and I will allow you to talk. Jasmine?
Hi, Jasmine.
Hey,
Jasmine, where are you calling in from?
I'm calling from Dayton, Ohio. That's how I knew who Micaiah Bryant was, because my organization led on the outreach for
Thank you
that.
so much for your work on
Thanks.
that.
Thank you. And again, I thank y'all so much for this because I learned a lot. I live in Ohio, and we actually have two identical bills to abolish the death penalty coming down the pipeline in Ohio. Unfortunately, it would just move most people to life imprisonment. But the interesting thing that I really wanted to expound upon, Joia, and kind of seek your advice on is about 68% of all of our death penalty cases comes out of 5 counties with the highest Black populations in Ohio. So that's Franklin, Cuyahoga, Hamilton, Lucas, and Summit counties. What is that education looking like in order for us to move the electorate? Because like Georgia, Ohio has voter suppression and anti-protest bills coming down a pipeline that absolutely are a reprimand for Black people rising up in 2020 and saying no more. So, like, how do we do that in light of the fact that most likely voter suppression and anti-protest bills will be coming down the pipeline in Ohio to further make sure that prosecutorial power isn't unchecked?
Sure. Well, first, I want to tell you some good news that you have my heart. And I just left from Ohio. I just left from Cincinnati. I was participating in the Faith Communities Abolition Week. And I spoke at Xavier University on their campus, and there was a large rally and crowd there in Cincinnati. So with those two bills, we have been closely, and when I say we, me along with other policy leaders and death penalty repeal abolitionists and analysts and strategists have been working really hard with the Legislative Black Caucus and also the Ohio Council of Churches. And so there have been some kind of grass tops organizing going on. There have been one-on-one conversations, and we are really, really hopeful that the governor is starting to listen to us in Ohio. Now, we never know how these things are going to turn. Like even in Georgia, even in Virginia, when I was working with Reverend Lakeisha Cook, because I do a lot of faith engagement strategies and also bringing more Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color into death penalty repeal strategies. But I will say Ohio is very hopeful. I put my email in the chat and I want you to connect with me because I am involved in about 7 different cohorts just in relation to Ohio death penalty repeal strategies. I know that there are a lot of other competing bills, but we've been working very closely with your elected official to push this issue of death penalty repeal to the top. I'm also planning a prayer breakfast for communities of faith along with Black elected officials in January. So I want you to stay connected to that. So I just wanted to let you know that we are pretty hopeful and all hands are on deck for Ohio when it comes to the abolitionist movement.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to that. And we need all the help we can get because we need a win. And this and the bail reform bills are the 2 wins I think we can get in Ohio before we lose other rights, unfortunately. So thank you so much. I did not know all of that. I'm looking forward to reaching back out to you.
Absolutely. It's a lot of great people on the ground in Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio was fully represented when we had our first, NNJ had our first boot camp. We had we were going to break into regions, but we couldn't even do that because Ohio had taken over like 2 tables because the Ohio contingent, and they came from across the state in Ohio. There are a lot of good people doing a lot of good work, policing work. One of our organizers for Resist ORP, OL, was Tamir Rice's cousin, that founded the Black Lives Matter chapter there. And so, yeah, there's a lot of people working on a lot of stuff in Ohio. And every state, everyone who comes on says their state is the worst. So trust, everyone will say our state is horrible because they're trying to pass legislation that's sometimes competing, right? The advocates are working towards something like pushing against, death penalty. And then on the other side, they're like pushing to increase gang legislation or something. There's always these competing things, and you're constantly trying to, stop all of the leaks that are coming through. But just keep up the good work, and Joia will be there to
thank you. I will be there quite frequently in 2022. Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you.
I do want to go back to a comment that was placed in the chat by Robert Allen. and we talked about life without parole. And he mentioned that life without parole, and please feel free to correct me, Mr. Allen, but we talked about it being more cost effective. But I also was thinking about, we talk about George Stinney a lot, with him being 14 years old and executed in America.
Joy,
There
you
are
want to talk a little bit more about George Stinney and who he was for those who might not know? I actually just, well, I'll talk about this later, but Kristen Henning mentions him in her book.
Yeah. George Stinney was a 14-year-old boy in the South who actually was playing on the same road as two white girls. Later on, those two white girls were actually found murdered. They were found killed. And George Stinney, he remarked that he had seen the girls. And just because he remarked that he had seen the girls, he was immediately brought into questioning and eventually charged with the death of those two young white girls. George Stinney was the youngest person in the United States of America that we have executed. He was executed by electric chair, and he was only 14 years old. And his case brought so many different bills in different states to say, hey, we shouldn't be killing children, should we? Of course, we should not be killing 14-year-olds. And I also mentioned in our questioning, additional questions and things to ponder on, is JLWOP something that we should still consider? There are states that still have JLWOP, and this absolutely means that we sentence people under the age of 18 to life without parole. I believe that that is still a form of a slow death when you think about somebody who is 13 or 14, regardless of what that crime may be. But again, these are my opinions, and I would just love to hear more about what you all think. And I just wanted to propose those. As I said in the beginning, I wanted us to leave with more questions than answers, because these types of issues are ongoing. We cannot solve them in 1 hour. So we definitely want to have more conversations and provoke more thought around that.
Yeah, and Robert, just to expound a little bit on what you're saying about it's more of a mental health, emotional death. My husband has been looking at this case in Texas where this young man was convicted of capital offense. Two people were murdered. Two young people were murdered. He was convicted of jail WAP, and he's finding all kind of inconsistencies in terms of like prosecutorial misconduct and ineffective counsel representation, and the judge doing all kind of crazy things. And this is a young kid who was sentenced at 18, and he has served, I believe, 15, 16 years at the time. And we all know that we change over time, right? From the time that you were 10 to the time that you're 20 to the time that you're 30, those of us who are in our 50s, going into 60, you change over time. And not to say that whatever crime happened was not horrific, but we know that young people's brains are not mature because we see it every day. They're stupid, right? They do stupid things, and not necessarily stupid to the point that they're killing someone, but they just do stupid things. And so the mental health aspect of this young man that my husband is trying to help right now is it's just horrible. He goes through periods of depression. Because he was a young man going into prison. He went into an adult prison because they charged him as an adult. And that's another thing you have to contend with, right? That you're a child going into an adult setting with adult men who have more experience than you, who have probably been in and out of the system longer than you. And it is just a horrific place to be. And so, yeah, emotionally, when you go in, you may not have had any need for necessarily speaking to someone about what you're going through emotionally, but when you come out, definitely you will have that. And hopefully, he will be able to come home. But if not, I mean, it is a huge toll. And people who have had people incarcerated, family members incarcerated, they will tell you that they are incarcerated with that person because they're never resting. They're always worried about their loved one who's incarcerated. And so having, the death penalty transferring into life without parole, I mean, I don't know what's what's worse? Is it worse for us to kill someone and then realize that maybe that person didn't actually commit the crime? Is it worse as a society that we're killing people, period? But I think that the mental aspect is definitely something that we need to continue to consider, because we all know just this year and a half going on 2 years of being in a situation where we're locked down in homes, you know, and unable to interact with people. Imagine if you are in a situation where you're not able to interact with your family and you're not able to interact with anyone else in the prison if you're in solitary confinement, for example. So the mental health aspect is huge. It really is. So I don't see any other questions, and I just want to, once again, Joia, thank you very much for participating today. And I think, did someone's hand just go up? Someone's hand just went up, maybe went up and went down. But definitely wanted to thank you so much. The information is like the maps, I'm telling you, people will be asking you for those. So if you could send me anything that you want me to forward to the folks who participated, I'd be glad to forward it on and make sure that we do that. And I want to remind all of you that we have another event coming up tomorrow. And this event is the documentary called On These Grounds. And this documentary is about a young woman who in South Carolina was pulled from her desk by a school resource officer. You've probably saw it on the news. It made national news. And the documentary is the story of a woman who's from Brooklyn who saw the incident and went down to South Carolina to assist the young girls, the young girl who the incident happened to, as well as the young girl who videotaped. They were both arrested. And so this is the story of how the community came together to talk about race and juvenile detention and juveniles being in schools where there's school resource officers, and there's mental health is in part of that. So we have the film screening at 6 o'clock, and then the post-screening discussion will be at 8, and that is on our website. And I'll put our website up so that everyone can go to that if they're interested in participating in that. And then on the 17th of November, we have Kristen Henning, who we'll be in discussion with, talking about the rage of innocence, how America criminalizes Black youth. So for those who are on and talking about young people, that will be another session that you will definitely want to join. And that will be November 17th at 2 o'clock. That's not on the website yet because I just got confirmation today. So, but it will be on our website soon. So with all of that, I want to thank you all for participating today. And thank you again, Joia, and have a good rest of the week. Be safe. And I'll make sure that you get all of the information that Joia sends to me. So thank you.